Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to our show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. But the least you could do is to watch this show, like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest tonight, Juan González. Juan is one of the most influential journalists in the United States and co-host of Democracy Now! He is the author of Harvest of Empire, a foundational work on U.S. intervention in Latin America and its link to migration. For decades, he has been a leading voice exposing U.S. imperialism, racial injustice, and corporate power. Juan, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Oh, my pleasure to be here.
I wanted to start with U.S. escalation against Venezuela. But before we come to Venezuela, if you could talk about the domestic politics in the United States that is driving this escalation. We are seeing regular killing, extrajudicial killing, if you like, in the Caribbean waters, international waters. All of these have been labeled as narco-terrorists done in the name of national security. But if you could unpack the domestic politics against immigration, against left-wing governments and experiments in Latin America, particularly in Cuba and Venezuela, and how all of that has been recently, or maybe not so recently, but have been packaged into this grand narrative of narco-terrorism and national security that would give some clarity for our viewers.
Well, clearly, ever since the second Trump administration came to power, there's been a marked change in one, the amount of attention that the federal government pays to Latin America, and two, the enormous crackdown. There have been other crackdowns on immigration throughout American history. This is not, you could go back to the 1850s. And the Know Nothing movement that sought to restrict and criminalize Irish immigrants when they came to the country in the 1840s. There was a very large Know Nothing movement in the country of essentially right-wing members of Congress and who sought to limit to extend the amount of time that Irish immigrants would have to be able to become citizens, to restrict their voting capacity, to criminalize them and jail them as the sources of unrest in the country, so even going, and then the Chinese exclusion period in the 1880s through to World War II. And then, of course, the many crackdowns on Mexican migration, the 1930s, Hoover, under President Hoover, the mass deportations, the 1950s under President Eisenhower, the Operation Wetback mass deportations. And now we have this latest wave under the second Trump administration. So this has been a hallmark of U.S. policy. In times of crisis, the system cracks down on migrant labor, which it recruits in times of economic expansion, but then criminalizes and attempts to scapegoat during economic crisis. So what we're having here, of course, in the United States, not just in the U.S., obviously, but throughout the industrialized West, is the crisis that imperialism is facing in terms of its inability to continue to expand across the globe. So it's cracking down on its own internally by once again targeting and scapegoating migrants. And in the case of the United States, it's particularly Latin Americans that are being targeted. So that, I think, is the root of the crisis. What's different here, though, is that unlike previous administrations that sought to, in one, either ignored Latin America because they were so preoccupied with the Middle East or with, let's say, in the case of the Biden administration, with the war in Ukraine, this administration has really, as part of its overall attempt to erect barriers to international trade, has decided to reassert the old Monroe Doctrine in a new way. Now it's basically trying to reestablish hegemony over Latin America. And so I think that you saw that right away when Trump started with his initially in his first weeks in office, his claims to reassert U.S. control over the Panama Canal. And by the way, I don't think most people have noticed, but that whole plan of his to have a private equity firm, Blackstone, take over the Hong Kong-based company, the ports in Panama,
CK
uh, uh,
Hutchinson.
has fallen through. In essence, the whole deal has collapsed, and there's been no word of it at all in the U.S. press because China immediately, because China still has sovereignty over Hong Kong, it began investigating the company CK Hutchison that was about to sell the ports to Blackstone and the consortium by Blackstone. And then Panama recently announced that it has put out for bids the sale of these ports all over again. And China is insisting that whoever takes over CK Hutchison, China will have veto power over the policies of that company. So the attempt by Trump early on to claim, oh, we've retaken the Panama Canal by pushing out this Chinese company has completely collapsed. But that's the big stick policy that Trump started, and he's increasingly now he is. We see what has happened with his the military attacks on small boats leaving either Venezuela or Colombia, and the claims um, that these are drug traffickers that are it's open season to be able to kill people just on the accusation of the United States that they are drug traffickers, and of course with the increasing threats of a possible direct military attack on Venezuela itself. And I think that that is the real danger that Latin America faces right now.
It's interesting that in the case of CK Hutchinson and the Panama ports, it's important to note that now that the US has effectively lost the trade and tariffs and sanctions war to China, that dynamics would no longer be what it used to be when Trump had just come to power and started using those coercive measures. If you could give us some specificity of U.S. escalation against Venezuela, because scholars on Venezuela, I'm thinking about Professor Steve Elner, Miguel Tinker Salas, they have been arguing that while there is a Latin American context, the countries specifically, Venezuela and Cuba, have been put under much harsher imperial aggression of war by the United States. To that extent, an escalation against President Lula in Brazil or other left-wing governments in Latin America is different from the escalation against the Cuban Socialist Project or the Venezuelan Bolivarian process. And we've seen this, one can go back as far as 1999, but at least since 2015, when Obama imposed the sanctions, we have seen a series of escalations in different forms, starting from assassination campaigns, sanctions, regime change operations, declaring oppositions as legitimate governments, and now the recent escalations. So talk about why Venezuela? Why is the ruling elites in the United States is so obsessed to extinguish the Venezuelan Bolivarian process?
Well, I think the key issue clearly is the vast oil and mineral wealth of Venezuela that even in the early years of the Chavez revolution, Venezuela still was largely selling its oil to the United States. And so American companies were still basically profiting from Venezuelan oil. And but what has increasingly happened in the during the Maduro period is that China has become the main purchaser of Venezuelan oil because as a result of all the sanctions, the heavy sanctions imposed first during Obama, but certainly in the first Trump presidency, followed up by Biden, and now the second Trump presidency, Venezuela has been forced to find other buyers for its oil. At one point, I think it was something like 70% of Venezuela's oil was going to China. Now it's down to about 45%, but it's still by far the largest buyer of Venezuelan oil. There was just an announcement in August that a private Chinese firm, China Concord Resources, has announced a deal to develop two new oil fields in Venezuela that are going to be producing 60,000 barrels per day. So they're investing $1 billion in Venezuela. So there is an increasing sense that the largest oil reserves in the world are slipping out of control of the United States. And of course, when we're dealing with a government that is doubling down on the importance of oil and natural gas in terms of its production, this is a problem. And of course, Trump was famously quoted, I think, during his first administration, saying, "Why don't we just take Venezuela's oil?" So I think that that's big. That's a big driving force. Is what is happening to where is the oil of Venezuela currently going, and where in the minds of the Trump administration it should be going. But that's part of the overall change in Latin America that is going to make a new U.S. intervention in the region extremely difficult. This is not the same Latin America of 100 years ago during the big stick policy first implemented by Teddy Roosevelt. It's not even the Latin America of 50 years ago. This is a region that is a lot more independent than it was in general decades ago. Today, China is the main trading partner for 9 countries in Latin America. It's the main trading partner for Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Venezuela, Peru, Bolivia, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Cuba. All of those countries depend more on their economic sustenance on China than they do on the United States. Those countries are not going to look favorably on a naked U.S. intervention in Latin America. And neither is Mexico. Even though Mexico's main trading partner is the United States, Mexico will not look favorably on any military intervention by the U.S. in Venezuela. So there will be much more opposition at the state-to-state level by the Latin American countries. We're not even talking about Honduras and Nicaragua and those countries that will also be very strongly opposed to U.S. intervention. So I think there'll be a lot more opposition at the state-to-state level. Then the other issue is at the level of the people. The Venezuelan, the United States has going to have a problem in terms of intervening in Venezuela. And I understand the aircraft carrier Gerald Ford is scheduled to arrive early next week in the Caribbean, and as part of the increasing military deployments. So how is the United States going to get rid of Maduro? They either have to try to go in there and assassinate him and maybe some of the other key leaders around him, and then seek to install a replacement government, which obviously would most probably be led by Maria Corina Machado. But how do you install that government? You either have to split off a section of the Venezuelan military, or you have to put your own boots on the ground to install that government. And I think that is going to be the big problem, and that's why there's still reluctance on certainly on some parts of the U.S. military to continue on this path, because uh, the Bolivarian Revolution has been in power now for over 25 years, and one of the key aspects of this revolution, which was distinct from other socialist revolutions that have occurred throughout Latin America, is that since Chavez rose within the military and developed a core of left-wing military officers, the revolution has always focused on politicizing the military in a progressive direction. So it's not going to be that easy to split the military, or there's a great possibility of civil war with sections of the military going for the in defense of the current government and others going opposed to it. So it's not going to be an easy situation to remove Maduro in that sense. And the other thing that I think people may not have seen, last week, Maduro put out a call for international volunteers to come to Venezuela to support the Bolivarian Revolution. And he said, if the U.S. attacks, we welcome anyone who wants to join with us to fight against this invasion. I guarantee you there will be Cubans who will be part of that resistance. There will be Nicaraguans who will be part of that resistance. And there will be Colombians. Now, this is another aspect of Latin American history that most outsiders don't really pay much attention to. The single largest and most extensive revolutionary movement in the history of Latin America took place in Colombia over the last 60 years. Colombia is a very big country. Colombia has 52 million people. It's the second largest Spanish-speaking country in Latin America, and it's almost at the level of Spain's population right now. And Colombia, for decades, had multiple left-wing guerrilla armies operating within the country and fighting the government. There was, of course, the biggest group was the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. But there was also the M19 guerrilla movement. There was the ELN, the National Liberation Army. There was the EPL, or the Popular Army for Liberation, and a half dozen smaller ones. But these were all major guerrilla groups that fought the military in Colombia for 30, 40 years. And one of them, the ELN, has never yet actually reached a peace accord. Well, the others have reached a peace accord. And the current president, Gustavo Petro, was a member of the M19. He was one of the guerrillas. So with next door to Venezuela there are hundreds of thousands of former guerrillas in Colombia, many of whom I believe will end up volunteering to support the Venezuelan revolution. So this will not be an easy task for the United States to accomplish an intervention or a regime change in Venezuela, because at the state-to-state level, Latin America is very different, and at the popular level, because there are so many movements that have developed in Nicaragua and Honduras and Cuba and Colombia, at the people-to-people level, there will be much more support for the Venezuelan government than had existed in previous U.S. interventions.
And there have been reports about even the opposition being fractured on the issue of military intervention. Reports are that when on the question of sanctions, the far-right opposition was relatively united, thinking that would pressure Maduro's government to topple. When it comes to the military campaign, even Edmundo González has been reported to distance himself from Maria Corina Machado. So that might be another factor to be taken into account when the U.S. is escalating its military campaign.
Yes, and I mean the opposition in Venezuela has always been very fractured. That's been part of its problem. It's never been able to unite, and of course, with the fiasco of Juan Guaido back several years ago, and there continued to be all of these fractures and divisions within the right-wing movement. And the only reason I believe that there's so much attention being placed on this, the Trump administration, is obviously the enormous influence that Marco Rubio, as a Secretary of State and as a strident anti-communist son of Cuban refugees, the influence that he has within the Trump administration. And it is Rubio who is really spearheading this, along with Stephen Miller, this effort to say, hey, we're just going to get rid of this government. Well, it's not going to be as easy as they think to do that. And I think, as you mentioned, the opposition itself within Colombia is divided on whether direct military intervention will make things better or worse for their opposition movement.
Just on a passing comment, it was very striking to me, your comment on the politicization of military in Venezuela. I mean, it is in striking contrast to what we saw in Chile between 1970 and 73. I was reading Paul Suiz's writing on Allende's inability to actually defend the revolution, and one of his central thesis was that he didn't politicize the military, assuming either assuming that the military would stay neutral, or being fearful about confronting the military. In either case, I was curious your thoughts on the role of countries like Brazil, given on one hand, with that China shift, the China-Latin American relationship expansion, we have seen huge deepening of ties between Brazil and China. I mean, the case of soybean is a very interesting example, given how much of China's leverage came from not just rare earths, but from soybean, shifting its import from the United States to Brazil, hurting the United States where it needs to be hurt. But Brazil has been not very clear about its relationship with Venezuela. We didn't see Lula during the swearing in of President Maduro. We had the president of Nicaragua, Ortega, and Cuban president there. So I'm curious what kind of role would Brazil play in this? Do you see has been making enough statement against what the U.S. is doing, or do you see that Brazil has been relatively failing in its duty to do what it should have done?
Well, I think that not only Brazil, but even Colombia under Petro was very critical of the most recent election results in Venezuela, and maintained a certain distance from the Maduro government. But I think that there are always differences, even among so-called progressive governments and leaders in the region. But I think there's relative unanimity on the issue of the era of of the United States dictating the affairs of Latin America are over. And I think that the Trump administration essentially shot itself in the foot by one, increasing tariffs to Brazil, and but specifically to interfere in the internal situation of Brazil, which was the trial of former President Bolsonaro for attempting to a coup, so I can't see that. That Lula would in any way support the uh, uh, an intervention, a U.S. intervention in Venezuela, no matter what differences he may have with the Venezuelan government. And I think now, will Brazil be perhaps as active in, let's say, supporting volunteers going to fight as Cuba or Nicaragua or some of these other countries will be? No, but they don't have to be. The main thing is that as a government, they will definitely stand up and say no to a military intervention or to a covert attempt to overthrow the government. So I think that uh, they will stand firm, in that way, and also that Brazil understands now again. uh, China plays a big role, and it certainly plays a role in the United Nations, but it also plays a role in the economic uh, progress of all of these countries. And Brazil understands that its future economic growth is more tied to uh, is less tied to the United States and more tied to a multipolar world order of which China and Russia and others are and Turkey are more integral partners with them.
This is my penultimate question, and I wanted you to explain to us a little bit about the relationship between different classes of Venezuelan migrants or immigrants to the United States and their relationship with far right politics, if you like, in the United States. Professor Steve Elner has written that about 15% of Venezuelan immigrants have citizenships in the United States, and they came from the upper layer of the class stratum, which who want to distinguish themselves, if you like, from the lower layers, which came later on in the later waves of immigrations, and they hate this kind of left-wing government there. And this is where in Florida, for instance, Trump went and did his campaign. And now, of course, a lot of them have got disillusion, as one of them noted, saying, we are all trendy Aragon now. But if you could tell us this class politics, class dynamics, and politics around immigration and far-right politics in the United States, that would be helpful.
Yeah, well, I think it's definitely true of the Venezuelan migration of the last, uh, let's say, last decade or so, that this is one of the um, most educated migrant flows in American history. I think the Migration Policy Institute has done some reports on this that you can check out online. But I think the number right now, and don't quote me the exact number, but I think it's over 50% of all the Venezuelans who have come to the United States in the past decade have a college bachelor's degree or higher. And the U.S. population, the U.S. adult population, only 37% of the U.S. adult population have a U.S. bachelor's degree or higher. So the Venezuelans who have come here, on the whole, not everyone, but on the whole, are far more educated than the Americans who are here. And they are certainly much more educated than the Venezuelans who stayed in Venezuela. So this is a highly educated population. And as you mentioned, many, not all, but many have come from the middle classes of Venezuela and the upper classes of Venezuela. They are more akin to the Cuban migration of the late 1950s, the Nicaraguan migrations of the early 1980s, in their class character. And so, therefore, they generally come, many of them, with anti-revolutionary or anti-socialist ideas. And my expectation is that once many of them get integrated into the United States and learn the language, they will rise up because they came with human capital. Even though they didn't come with their belongings, they came with the education that they received and their class ties, and so they have much more human capital, and they will quickly rise up within the Latino community into more sort of privileged sectors. But this is something that is not just true of the Venezuelans. Generally speaking, uh, the migration from Latin America of the last 20 years has been much more uh, middle class than in previous years. This is true, people coming from Colombia, even coming from Puerto Rico. In the 1950s, migrants from Puerto Rico were largely unskilled, and who came as agricultural workers or who came as hotel workers or factory workers. Today, those coming from Puerto Rico, where I was born, most are college educated. They are engineers, they are doctors, they are people who, because of the collapse of the economic levels in Latin America, the middle classes can no longer uh, be progress and find jobs in their fields of study. So they migrate. And so, generally speaking, I believe part of the increasing conservatism politically within the Latin American community is a reflection of a class change in the migration process, uh, uh, and uh, and so you're getting people who have more sort of belief in the system of capitalism, who are coming to this country, uh, uh, especially from Venezuela. But I believe it's true in many of the other countries, whether it's Mexico or Puerto Rico or Colombia or Peru.
My final question, it's about something that we discussed the last time we had you on about the left conversations about certain governments. And last time we discussed about China, Russia, Iran. But I want to shift that conversation to Venezuela at this moment, given that's the most important thing. And there have been great debates in Latin American journals regarding this question around demonization of Maduro, even within sections of the left. And I wanted to ask you your thoughts on this debate, given even Zoran Mamdani, at a time when the US is amassing vast military assets around the coast of Venezuela, which even mainstream media like Bloomberg are saying that it's just a matter of time now or when the US invasion would happen rather than if. Mamdani says that a democratic socialist is different from the dictators in Cuba and Venezuela. I mean, that does reflect something about the US left. And even in Democracy Now!, and I haven't gone through all the archive, but we have seen Democracy Now! Hosting Gabriel Hetland, but not people like Steve Elner or Miguel Salas Tinker, who say that it is important to defend Maduro despite some of his mistakes, which are heavily tied to the US sanctions, some of which Hetland and others do not think as such. They think that the left can actually defend socialism in Venezuela and at the same time propagandize against in favor of overthrowing Maduro. So I wanted to have your thoughts on these tendencies within the left in the United States, and if you could even share how you feel about these debates.
Yeah, well, it's I think that writers like Domenico Lasordo, who wrote about this years ago, this the nature of Western Marxism, that Western Marxists believe in socialism in theory, but condemn virtually every exercise and practice of socialism around the world. And I think you cannot have it both ways. You can argue for a democratic socialism. There's no doubt about that. And my experience is that democratic socialism is a great term in theory, but in practice, capitalism will crush any government that is democratic socialist, and because it doesn't operate in the real world of a constant battle between capital and labor to for greater freedom for the majority of the people on the planet. So I think that that there is a tendency of folks in the United States and in Western Europe to criticize all of these developments of socialist models around the world, whether it's in China, Vietnam, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and all have their faults in one way or another, but there's a basic difference between them and the system as we know it in the advanced capitalist West, which is that their governments are attempting to build a better life for the majority of their people, and often they succeed in ways that they don't get much attention for. And so I think that you can be critical, but at the same time not fall into the trap of how easily democratic socialist movements can be crushed when they become real threats to capitalism. And Allende is not the only example. There are many throughout history of even social democratic movements that really weren't as socialist. If you look at Juan Bosch in the Dominican Republic. He uh, he was uh, he was a democratic socialist, and he came to power. And as soon as he began moving in a direction that the system did not want, he was crushed and overthrown. And so I think that uh, that's the basic problem that all of the supporters of democratic socialism uh, uh, have, that they cannot abide by the reality that sometimes in order to implement socialism you have to go to war against those who try to crush you. And so I think that that's a continuing debate that the left in the United States and in Europe will have. But I always fall more on the side of the main goal of a socialist movement is to improve it should be to find ways to improve the living conditions and the life of the vast majority of the workers of a country.
Agreed. And I would add that we should not lose sight of how imperial escalation makes that project more and more difficult. Because, I mean, in Venezuela, for instance, there are clear evidence about some of the steps that Maduro has had to take, has to deal with sanctions. But let's leave it there, Juan. It was a pleasure
Okay.
having. Please
Thank
go
you.
ahead.
And thank you for the invitation to share some thoughts with you.
Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.